You're listening to Cultivation Elevated, hosted by Michael Williamson and Anders Peterson, where we discuss vertical farming and the future of cannabis and food production.
Hey, what's going on, Durs?
What's up, Michael? M Dubs, my buddy.
How are you?
I'm doing good, man. It's Friday. It's been a good week, and I'm heading to Germany tomorrow for ICBC Berlin.
Nice. Well, I'm glad I could catch you in between planes, trains, and automobiles. Let's just get into it. I know we're going to be talking a bit about tier spacing at different stages and some strategies around that. So let's give these listeners what they really want.
Yeah, I think this is a good topic and an interesting one that I see a lot of cultivators and people endeavoring upon these projects spending a lot of time somewhat stressing about or overthinking and I wanted to help try and put some guidance and pros and cons about some of that. So for those listening, what we're discussing is in multi-tier cultivation or vertical farming, you have a distance between your grow tray and then the bottom of your grow lights. And that is what we call tier heights or tier spacings. And so that is essentially the effective distance you have to put your substrate and then the vertical space you have to have your plants grow. And it's different between a mother, a veg, and a flower room. And after over 3,000 rooms that PIP has designed and installed, we've learned some kind of best practices. And we've also seen through this data where most growers typically fall into in terms of height. And so that's what we wanted to discuss today was, how much space you have to grow per tier and what are some of the considerations for it. I'd like to start with flower rooms if you don't mind, because I think that's where we get the most questions.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do it. So again, from tray to bottom of grow light, we see quite a wide variation of tier spacing. Most flower rooms we're looking at are 2 levels. So typically between both levels, the spacing or tier heights we're talking about is equidistant. Very rarely do we see different tier spacing in a flower room. They're almost always equal. To kind of get right to it, I would say a lot of cultivators who are new to multi-tier cultivation are very worried about plant stretch and their plants growing into the lights. And a byproduct of that is they often request from us and our designers a very tall tier spacing to kind of give themselves some buffer and some comfort factor. And when we say tall spacing, to me, that's really anything over 6.5 feet from tray to bottom of grow light. So, but it's not uncommon for us to have requests for 7-foot tier spacing. I've seen 8-foot tier
I was
spacing.
gonna say I've seen 8 requested too.
Yeah, and then, and so that's really what the heart of the conversation is today. There's some pros and cons. The first thing I would say for a really tall tier height is your lighting efficiency and your airflow efficiency. So when your plants are young and you've moved them into veg, and let's say they're 18 to 24 inches tall, that's 18 to 24 inches off the tray. With an 8-foot tier spacing, you still have 6 feet of distance between the top of your plants to your lights and then your top-down airflow system, like vertical air solutions, your in-rack airflow system. That means your lights need to penetrate 6 feet to hit your canopy. And that means your airflow system needs to be able to supply the appropriate air velocity 6 feet below that ductwork all along the length of your row. Can it be done? Absolutely. Is it the most efficient way of doing it? Not in my opinion. For example, I mean, as we get more and more competitive in these markets, having to run your lights at 100% in week 1 or close to 100% in the first few weeks of flower because of that distance to achieve your target PPFD means that you're now running more electricity. And so you're having to operate at a higher cost electrically with this taller tier spacing because you need to achieve your lighting levels further away from your light fixtures. Same goes for your airflow system. With our vertical air solutions VAS 2.0 system, we have data 5 feet and below in how our system performs, but that doesn't mean necessarily we would recommend it because you are going to have to run your fans at 100% to achieve that kind of minimum air velocity. And so then as your plants grow up, of course, you're now dimming down your LED fixtures and turning down the EC motors on your airflow system, but you could have achieved the same parameters with a shorter tier height and less electricity. So that is, to me, kind of the root of it, is some of the negatives of doing this. One of the others that comes to mind is ceiling height is a big factor when we're talking about tier spacing. A lot of the times when we see 7 or 8 foot tier heights, the top of the racking system is extremely close to the ceiling, extremely close to the roof. And so they're saying, I have the ceiling height, let's maximize the height of the racks. Why wouldn't we? Well, Michael, can you talk to that a little bit? I mean, we've talked about that concept quite a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people get enamored with this idea of just how much canopy I can fit in and all this space, but they tend to forget about all the low-hanging stuff that may exist in the facility. And typically, when we get drawings at PIP, we don't get the mechanical drawings. We typically get a bird's eye view architectural drawing that may have mechanical, but typically doesn't. We don't have
Yeah.
usually elevations as well, or like a side angle view. And so, as you were saying, they go, oh, I got an 18-foot ceiling, so I want 16-foot tall racks. If they're on a carriage system, they're probably 16, 4 or 5 inches, all said and done. And now you're left with maybe 18 inches. Everything looks good on paper, but then it's like, well, where do your sprinklers go? And where's your ducting go? Is your ducting flush mounted to your grills above the lid, or is it inside the room? Do you have air handlers hanging down? Do you have P-traps hanging down? Maybe there's air returns. Maybe you're kind of old school and have independent dehumidifiers that you're now sticking above your room. So there's all these kind of booby traps that come out once you start building something. Also, sometimes people think that they have like true internal dimensions. They'll be like, my room's 32 by 34. And then there's a miscalculation, or they didn't take into consideration that maybe the insulated metal panels that they're using are actually 6 inches wide and not 3 or 4 like they thought. And so they start to just lose inches, and it can be on the top, it can be on the sides. And so, that's a common problem. Also, we talk about this a lot, and it's not quite like a greenhouse, but there's some comparables. You typically are looking for some kind of environmental bubble above your canopy. You want some breathing room up there. And so that you can get kind of humidity and treated air up off your crop. And
That's
so,
exact that buffer space above the racks. And that's one of the cons of pinning your racks as close to the ceiling as possible, is there's nowhere for heat to rise, for air to mix, and for air to flow. And we call it kind of choking the room out in a sense. I mean, look at greenhouse designs. Why over the last 3, 4 decades have gutter heights gotten taller and taller
taller
and
and
taller?
taller.
Air volume. It creates more of a buffer so that the outdoor air conditions have less of a extreme effect and swing on the indoor greenhouse environment. And it's the same concept in multi-tier. If you over maximize your space, there are negative repercussions of that in terms of environmental control. And so that's another thing about making these 7, 8 foot tier heights, when you have 16, 18 foot ceilings, that can be really challenging.
When you highlighted something earlier too, so it's like if you're someone who's like, I want my lights at, let's call it 8-foot tier heights or 7-foot tier heights, like you said, you're gonna have to put your lights on probably about 100% to get to, I don't know, 500, 600 micromoles for your first kind of weekend as you're transitioning from veg, or more if you'd like to push more light. And now you're pinned at 100% on your electric bill, and you don't really have control. The plant's now in control of managing how much light it'll take. And so, as the plant gets taller, the micromole level picks up. But the inverse of that is you're using a dimmer to control that. Now, in that one example, in the first example, the plant's kind of in charge based on how much light it's going to take, how much it's going to stretch. Where in the other situation, at a lower canopy height, it's a lot more efficient to get air all the way through canopy. It's a lot more efficient to get light all the way through canopy. And then as the plant's growing, or as you want to manipulate the plant growth, you have the ability to throttle something. In the first situation, you have nothing to throttle. There's
Hmm.
no dimming capability. It's 100%, and it's going to be 100%. You might have to dim down at some point potentially, but you just don't have that minute adjustability.
Yep. Let's go to the other extreme. Let's talk about really short tier heights in flower. And then I'd like to touch on kind of what we both think are our ideal or sweet spot kind of tier
Sure.
heights. So
Nice.
one of the examples that comes to mind as we work on these projects is a project in Switzerland I'm working on right now. It's a second story grow, so it's in a big commercial warehouse, but they are a tenant on the second floor. And essentially, they have a little bit over 10 feet in ceiling height, and they're doing 2 tiers of flower. Now, they already naturally grow small plants, and they also veg basically for 1 to 3 days. So they're doing almost a no veg kind of strategy, but you're left with a pretty small tier height. So, I mean, what are some of the concerns there?
I mean, high labor, high cost of labor materials. What do you know what their plant density is? Is it like 32, 64? Is it one of
They're doing
those?
about a 0.83 planting density, so plants per square foot.
So what is
So
that
it's a
like?
little bit less than a plant per square foot.
Okay. Yeah. So, that's a lot more cuttings. That's a lot more mom stock. That's a lot more grow substrate. That's a lot more transplanting. I find that sometimes sprays can be a little bit more challenging in higher density stuff. Um, Very doable. It's not terribly uncommon. It's what kind of used to be referred to as like a sea of green approach, and no topping, just one, big
Hmm.
colas kind of going all the way down. The people that I see who are growing the furthest away from the light historically, and unless they were already on this like kind of sea of green, high density planting model beforehand, they're people that basically got I don't know, I don't have a terminology for it, but they basically are like they're afraid of photons. They basically transitioned from HPS and they went to LED and they didn't really understand how to dim and control some of those features, and they essentially fried their plants from too much light. Or maybe like you were talking about earlier, the plants grew through the lights. They had maybe some phyto bleaching. Maybe they had to cut tops off to keep it from growing into the next tray. And it's almost like it's a traumatizing event for a grower, especially a new grower to LED. And so naturally, they become kind of like afraid of the photons. And so they'll typically grow smaller plants. They might have like 4 feet from the light to the top of the canopy in some cases.
Yep.
And as you know, if you're growing smaller plants, you're not doing it in a high density format, you're probably sacrificing quite a bit in yield.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and in this example too, though, going with the shorter, let's say it's 4 to 4.5 feet tier spacing, roughly, depending on the room. So that's from tray to light, 4 to 4.5 feet. That is where you have to be concerned about plant stretch and growing into the lights. That is where your cultivation schedule is needs to be very dialed in and very exact. So you know how it is with running a grow. It's you plan everything out on a calendar and you do your best to stick with it. But there's always, wrenches thrown into the gears where you can't exactly always, you have to have some wiggle room. With these
Absolutely.
really short tier heights, there's way less buffer and wiggle room, especially with a 1 to 3 day veg. If you, for whatever reason, need to keep your plants in veg and hold them back for a few more days, and they now veg 7 to 10 days, and then you flip them into this 4 to 4.5 tier spacing and flower, you're going to run into some problems.
I think things to consider are your substrate type and volume. If you're in a really tight distance between tiers, you don't want the tallest pot, or maybe you don't want to be a block on top of another big block. You really want to get that substrate kind of low and wide, and kind of minimalistic.
Every inch matters in that scenario, or
Big
centimeter
time.
in Europe.
And then, right, there you go. And then the other thing too to think about is in one of those lower tier spacing where it's really tight like that, you probably have a restriction on the diversity of genetics that you can grow. Where when you have maybe a 6.5 or 7 foot tall spacing in between your tier heights or in between your elevations, you can grow squatty, shorter, bushier plants, but you can also grow taller, lankier plants as well. So,
Yeah.
you have more flexibility in what you can grow. I
Hmm.
imagine Switzerland and a lot of the EU, they're probably not running 50 genetics. They're probably running a few very specific things. Are they doing CBD or is it THC?
This is actually a THC grow in Switzerland.
Okay. So, but that would be another challenge I would think is just you're probably not growing OG Kush. You're probably
No,
not growing any haze.
you
Nothing
know,
that really stretches much. And you need to
but
manipulate all that quite a bit too.
Well, but then on the flip side, a pro of these shorter tier heights, if you are able to manage plant height and manage your genetic selection, a pro is, light uniformity and penetration. So you will get very good uniformity. Like our colleagues over at Fluence, they talk about it a lot where on their spider fixture in particular, the light bars are spaced 8 inches center on center. And that ratio is also the ideal finishing height. So, meaning those bars are spaced 8 inches apart. Ideally, for perfect uniformity on your canopy, you're finishing your canopy 8 inches away from that fixture. So, in a 4.5 foot tier spacing, you're growing basically a little bit less than a 4 foot plant from tray to top of canopy. That's including the height of your substrate. So that needs to be factored in. That's easier to achieve in that shorter tier spacing is that finished plant height and distance from fixture for good light uniformity and penetration. And on the in-rack airflow side, blowing the air through these lights down into the canopy like VAS, you will have more than enough airflow and penetration too, where you can really start balancing these parameters and getting that air penetration deep into the canopy. On the Again, though, on the flip side of that, if your plants do get too tall, you get right up into the lights, you're going to be choking out the room again with that big dense canopy where there's no room for air to flow and mix. So that's kind of the two extremes, the really tall and the pretty short. Now I'm happy to throw my hat in the ring. My ideal tier spacing from tray to light is 5.5 feet. I see a lot of people prefer 6 feet, but it's within that range, in my opinion, is 5.5 to 6 feet. And it depends obviously on your ceiling height. Again, we talk about these buffer spaces above, between, behind, in front of the racking structures in the rooms for good climate control. So I think that's where that range of 5.5 to 6 feet comes in is, depending on your room dimensions and size, that's the height I would target personally.
I wish that I could like debate you on this, but I just don't. I don't disagree. I really don't. I wanna take a different position just to argue, but no, I think that's pretty spot on. What I will say, I want people to think about two things. One, think about the average height of a worker, an employee. Let's call I don't know, 5'8", 5'10", something in that range. So if you have to track and trace every single plant, though a lot of people don't do this, in most states you're supposed to weigh each plant and harvest. Um, you want to be able to handle that plant without it dragging on the ground, or you don't want to have an employee have to hold every plant above their head just so that they can not drag it on the ground. So I always think about stuff like that, like the handling process afterwards. Um, what is it like to defoliate? If you're on the first tier in a first tier of the grow room, ideally your feet are on the ground. But if you start to get into a 6 or 7 foot tall plant, now you need a little step stool. Or you got to
Mhm.
put I don't even know if the elevate, I'm trying to think of how low elevate can go. But I guess you could put an elevate in, but it'd be goofy. You'd have like a platform, 8 or 12 or 16 inches off the ground. Um, so that's one thing to think about. Now, if you're like, hey, I grow big plants, I'm an HPS grower, my plants are normally 7 feet tall, I'm going to multi-tier, I know I can't quite grow them 7 feet tall, but I really want them to be 6 feet tall or something like that. If you're going down that path and you're switching over to LED, I would highly encourage you to look at some of the under canopy lighting options that are now available pretty commercially and pretty reasonably from a fine
Mhm.
economic standpoint. There's several companies that have under canopy lighting. I'm seeing new ones pop up all the time. The last couple of trade shows, I've seen new companies, or maybe spins on old companies, maybe some rebranding. But the sub canopy or inner canopy lighting, I should say. And if you're not familiar with the concept of inner canopy lighting, you typically have seen your lights above the canopy. But as Anders was highlighting earlier, the photons only travel so deep in the canopy, and depending on how well you maintain your canopy with leaf removal and things like that, and you can restrict how far photons reach on the canopy. And as we've discussed before, um, leaves are either sources or sinks. And so that's another thing to be thinking about.
And if you're interested on this topic, Dr. Allison Justice from Cannabis Research Coalition and the Hemp Mine, she did a great study on this where she did try to determine at what light level does a leaf become a source of energy or a sink of energy? Is it productive or is it a drain on the plant's resources? And don't quote me on this, but I believe she found a leaf getting 200 ppfd or less is now becoming a sink of energy, which means I think she hypothesized that you could defoliate that leaf, and then you don't need it because it's not helping the plant. It's actually pulling resources away, and it's like primarily sugars or photosynthetes. And so, with this inner canopy lighting strategy, now you can bump those lower leaves that aren't receiving 200 ppfd or more. You can now give them that light level. There'll be more sources of energy the plant's producing and less sinks. So you ultimately get, I've heard numbers in between 20 to 30% increase in yield. You also have some reduction in labor costs because you don't have to strip as many leaves or defoliate as strong, but there's a balance between that to make sure you're not getting powdery mildew or restricting airflow. But yeah, it's really quite an interesting development in indoor cultivation. How do you say that applies to the tier height discussion?
Well, in terms of inner canopy lighting, or, like I was saying earlier, the taller your elevations are in between each tier, the less light is going to penetrate through.
Yeah, okay.
And so you may want to consider, if you're like, I'm growing tall plants, I don't care what these clowns say on this podcast. Um, Got to make fun of yourself sometimes, right?
Yeah.
But that being said, I would strongly look at inner canopy lighting because it is relatively economical. They're not huge power draws. And what we're seeing typically, and there's a pretty good amount of research out there from different companies. But we're seeing that basically upwards to 20, some people are claiming a 25% increase in yield. And the part that that's always great. That's monstrous. I mean, in traditional ag, if you can get a 1% greater yield, every farmer is going to do that thing as long as it makes financial sense. So when you start talking about 20% increase in yield, that's like unheard of in all other
Hmm.
crops, unless you're doing some, nasty chemistry stuff. But that being said, well, the better part of it is yes, you get the bigger yield, but if you were to think about the plant from the top all the way down, the closer colas or buds to the top of the plant, those would be like your A grade buds or your A size buds. And then the middle part's kind of that B grade or B size, so they're a little bit smaller. And then the bottom of the plant, is typically referred to as like C grade. LARF would be another word that's kind of commonly thrown around. But what's now happening with inner canopy lighting, because those that plant material is no longer a sink and is a source, and it's getting some adequate or improved light down there, we're seeing that the C's turn into B's and the B's turn into A's. And typically in more mature markets, there's grading differences between, or there's a financial benefit, not just to the yield, but also the fact that your B's or your C's, which were not packageable before, maybe got ground up for trim, pre-rolls or something of that nature, or edibles, are now in a more sellable form of B grade or even A grade. So yeah, just something to kind of think about for people who are adamant about growing tall plants in a
Yeah.
multi-tiered environment. You should probably take a good look at inner canopy lighting.
Yeah. And,
But
and so then to kind
I would
of,
not recommend that for the client in Switzerland who only has very little elevation to work with and is going to get most likely plenty of light through their canopy.
yeah. Okay. So to kind of summarize too on this 5.5 to 6 foot sweet spot of tier spacing, tier heights, what that ends up looking like in a two-tiered flower room is your first tray is about 16 to 18 inches off of the floor. Then you have that 5.5 to 6 foot tray to light height. And then between tiers, it's anywhere between, it could be as much as 8 inches of space, maybe a little bit more depending on some of the variability in these designs. Then you have your second tier. And so ultimately, you're looking at roughly a 14-foot system from the floor to the top, maybe 14 and a half feet, with two 5.5 to 6 foot tier spaces. So that's ultimately the total finished height of that system is a little bit over 14 feet and, give or take a few inches. And so that means ceiling height, something like this should be minimum 16 to 18 feet off the floor. And then that'd be kind of ideally for me, I'd like at least 20 feet, I would say. The more the merrier, in my opinion, for that air volume and buffer. So if I had a 14-foot rack and I had 20-foot ceilings and I had, let's say 5.5, 6-foot tier spacings, that to me would be kind of the ideal vertical spacing and design and layout for my flower rooms.
Yeah,
Also,
I don't disagree with that at all.
yeah. Okay. I know we started with flower rooms. We were going to maybe talk about veg and mother spacing as well and some of those. There's more variability on that side. I would say there's probably less debate on flower rooms, more debate and discussion on veg and flower and how you can do that depending upon your cultivation strategy, substrate strategy, mother like stock plant strategy. So that's way more variable. I would say there's less debate on the flower side on what these kind
Yeah,
of sweet
there's a
spots are.
couple of trends we see on the veg side. So let's say you're specing a 12-foot rack in flower. I'd say most people are specing a 12-foot rack in veg, and the only difference is it's 3 tiers instead of 2 tiers.
Yep.
So that's pretty common. Every now and then someone will say, "Oh, I want an extra 2 feet in my veg." So maybe they have a 12-foot in flower and they have a 14-foot in the veg room. Well, let's talk about like an ideal person that says, I veg for 10 days. I'm a rock wool grower. I maintain BPD. I've dialed in my rooting in irrigation strategies. I'm in that club of from bottom of substrate to top of plant. I'm in that 18 inches or so. Those people are typically on like a 12-foot rack
Yeah, you
because
have
it's
roughly around 3.5 feet of tier height from tray to light. And I mean, clones are 6 to 8 inches when they start. And then you're probably, if you're in Rockwell or let's say 1 gal cocoa bags and you're flipping your plants at 18 to 24 inches, you still have a foot, sometimes a foot and a half of space between the top of your canopy and your lighting system in veg. So, 3 to 3.5 feet is more than enough for most people in that kind of strategy.
And it's the fastest room typically in cultivation, I guess, that and clone room. But clone room is a lot easier because you're managing a lot of tiny plants in a usually a small tray where these are independent plants. But it's typically for most, I think, advanced cultivators, they're vegging for 10 to 14 days. So plants come in, plants go out. There's a lot of transitional stuff there. It's not uncommon to have cultivators say, I veg for 3 or 4 weeks, though. They typically have various levels of stress, maybe a lack of vigor during different transitional stages. And so they'll say things like, yeah, it kind of looks kind of shitty now, but give it a week and it bounces back. So we do see these like stalling moments. We try and educate as best we can on, that you can grow plants without having to say things like it'll bounce back, you go and address the root cause issue and stay in that kind of heterosis hybrid vigor. But yeah, those folks typically may need more of a 14-foot tall rack or even a 16-foot tall rack if you're going to be vegging for 3 or 4 weeks. It really just depends on, again, your strategy and your approach.
And your building constraints again, always. Maybe it makes sense to kind of stop this conversation here and pick up another week and discuss more about some of the considerations for veg, mother, or mixed use nurseries, because that's where you can have, I think it'd be good to go over some of those considerations. I think it'd be good to not have this one go too long.
Yeah, I mean the mother strategy on its own is its entire
That's
podcast.
right.
So I know you're traveling to Germany. So maybe in a couple weeks when you get back, let's plan on picking up right there.
Let's do it.
In
Oh.
the meantime, all of you listeners, please smash all the buttons that matter. And thank you for listening. We provide you this service free of ads and advertisements. It's something that Pip is very passionate about, and it's important to us. Anders and I have a lot of good personal experience over the years, but our true strength is that we're interacting with customers every single day that are either having success or working to get to be successful. And so we get to kind of see under everybody's hood, and we see a lot of the same problems. We try and offer as much free, good information that we know is backed by something proven, whether it's operational experience or science. But we want to see people be successful, not just with PIP equipment, but with all vertical farming tools. And there are these nuanced details from design to operations that we're just trying to let people know what we see, what works well, what doesn't work well. And we're students at the end of the day. We're students of
Yeah.
life. So we're constantly learning as well. So feel free to reach out to either one of us. You can kind of get a hold of us through all the normal channels. And we'd be happy to talk to you about your projects that you're thinking about doing or that you're retrofitting or any of that stuff. So
Yeah.
just consider us a lot more than just a racking company.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for listening today. And again, like Michael said, if you have any suggestions for things you'd like to hear us to talk about, or any questions, or even wanted to reach out and tell us your tier heights and how it's working for you, feel free. We'd love to talk with you.
All right. Till next
All right,
time.
Michael.
All
Have a good
right.
one.
Peace.